Okay, let's get this to try and work. I'm real grateful to George. I got to know him, trying to think about how long it was. It's a bit of a blur. And no sooner did I get to know George than he was willing to put me to work. And wow, I've learned an incredible amount. In many ways, I'm sitting here looking at a room full of folks, some of whom are my teachers right now, and a good teacher is a good learner. So I'm learning from you, even as you're learning from me, this evening and through the rest of the week. George gave me two of my favorite topics. The issue of contextualization is a big issue for me. Being from a slightly different culture myself, but I'll never remember a pastor who made trips to Africa, but he came back to the U.S. and we were talking about contextualization, and he said, well, it's really simple. There is no culture to the American church, and there are no people groups. Problem of contextualization solved. And I kind of went, And so we're going to discuss two things. I want to give you a mental picture to start us thinking about contextualization when I'm done, and I want to discuss whether contextualization is even biblical. Because if it's not biblical, we shouldn't do it. And if it is biblical, we need to have a paradigm, we need to have a mental picture that we can bring to the issue. So we're going to see if it's justified, and then we're going to see some ways of dealing with this issue. One of my favorite places is to turn to Acts 17.
Amen. I love that passage.
Well, good. God put it there just for you. No, He also put it there for us. The irony of this, we're going to be in the section where Paul's dealing with the philosophers from Athens. And I'm going to stick pretty much with verse 22 and on as he makes his speech. I have been in enough New York subways to know that you don't always get the chance to share the whole gospel, especially if it's an express subway train and you're going between stops. So we don't always get the full chance, but we do get chances, we do get opportunities, don't we? And we're going to get some opportunities this week. The backdrop of 22 really is in verse 16. And I want to give you a little bit of context. Paul's roaming around Athens, and he's seeing all their idols. This is a Jewish kid raised by one of the great grandsons of one of the great rabbis. And so let's just say that Greek myth and paganism were not his flavor of choice. In fact, he's going through the city and his spirit's provoked. I don't mean he was mad at every Athenian. I think he was upset with the objects of their worship. In a good way, our spirit should be provoked. Not against who we're sharing with, but against the things that are binding them. Yeah. Our spirit's provoked for dear Muslims who we would like to see enter into the freedom that Jesus has for them. Our spirits ought to be provoked like Paul's was provoked. And so that's the backdrop. And he begins talking in the marketplace. And sure enough, a group of the philosophers get together, and they think he's some sort of nut. I mean, that section 16 through 21, right before it in 20, it says that these things were strange to their ears. It was weird. Who is this weird guy in the marketplace talking to us this way? And that's sort of the backdrop. Now, what's interesting is what Paul does. Paul stands in the midst of Mars Hill. You might have the Greek version of it. That was like the philosophy classroom of the day. Okay? And as he's standing there, he's getting ready to talk to these men. And he says, "Men of Athens, I perceive in all things you're very religious." Do you understand how absolutely contextual that was? Do you think a Jewish guy who didn't believe in idolatry, think about him saying, "I could see you're very religious." I mean, he could have said, "You're all a bunch of stupid pagans. How can you believe that a bunch of stone things are going to do anything from you? How can you believe the created object is going to somehow connect you with some sort of power that's going to do anything from you. And already he's talking to his audience where they're at. And he's being somewhat complimentary. I don't think he's being disingenuous, as we're going to see, but I think he's reaching them where they are. I can see the Greek word, I think, is the word devout. I can see you're devout. Now, he's not talking about the quality of their devotion, but he's reaching them where they live. And he says, I can see that you're all very religious, and as I passed by and considered the objects of your worship, I found an altar with an inscription to the unknown God. And that's sort of the backdrop there, where he's talking to them. And he starts talking about one of the objects he's seen of their own worship. Okay, he could have picked up a 12-pound Torah scroll and just said, here, read this. Okay? But he talks to them about one of their objects. Now, there's a history behind the altar to the unknown God. And Paul knew it. The Athenians had a plague of pestilence. And this Cretan guy comes. Paul has a lot to say about Cretans, and most of it isn't very pleasant. Check out Titus. And this Cretan guy comes and he says, I logically perceive two things. And if you want the story, it's in a book called Eternity in Their Hearts. And he says, I perceive two things. One, some God has caused this plague, and two, he's one of the gods you haven't sacrificed to. I said, well, we don't want to pick the wrong one, so let's just make an altar to the unknown God. Now, what's so interesting to me about that is Paul's using some of the Athenians' own history, their own objects of worship, and he's using that as a cultural bridge in order to reach these guys. And so, can I build a case for contextualization? Yeah, I sure can. I don't think Paul did it wrong. I don't think he was totally not knowing what he was doing here. And then he goes from that altar to the unknown God, which is the cultural bridge. And he says, the God that you don't know, I will proclaim to you. Now, he could have said, okay, crazy people. Okay, you haven't gotten it right yet. I'm going to ignore everything. The altar to the unknown God, that's a farce too. But instead he says, let me start where you guys need to know the information. Okay? And I'm going to start with the fact that you don't know the real God who's there, who's unknown. He's unknown, all right. In fact, that's the word we get agnostic from, is the word unknown. The altar to the agnostic deity. And I'm going to tell you about this deity that you don't know. And he starts with creation. You've got to meet people where they're at. And Paul's not afraid to contextualize. How do you teach a child? We homeschooled 5 kids. And so when our kids were 3, we did not pull out calculus. Okay, kids, here's calculus. Let's start here. What is the area under a curve? We started with silly little Cuisinart rods. I remember that, with different sizes, where we were showing them. And we started where they were at. And contextualization, where Paul's concern, is taking and creating a bridge from what his audience is to him, so that he can get the truth to his audience in a way that they're going to understand it. And he begins with what they don't know. And he begins with where he can start. Athenians, I need to tell you some things that you need to know. No matter how you approach it, Paul didn't consider that a waste of time. And he talks about the God who made heaven, and he is Lord of heaven and earth, and he's not worshipped with things made by their hands. And he's essentially saying, you've been going about this the wrong way. Okay? I've started with this bridge, and now I'm telling you that there's some information, there's some corrections that are absolutely necessary. And then he continues going from there. But the first thing we need to understand is, if we're going to talk about contextualization, how far is too far, is contextualization allowed? Yeah, it is. I've got Paul's word on it through the Holy Spirit. Contextualization is allowed. That doesn't mean all contextualization is acceptable. What it means is we have a biblical basis for the idea that we need to reach people where they are. So now we have to start asking questions here. Okay? We have to start asking what's allowed and what's not allowed. I had a beautiful PowerPoint with a field with a fence around it. And what I've discovered is that Christians usually start by arguing about what's in the field. That's where they usually start. Is this practice okay? Is that practice okay? Is this practice okay? And they start arguing about the daisies in the field. So what I want to do, you're going to have a panel of folks that are probably going to do far more than I am with this, okay? But my way of conceiving this is the overhead view. Instead of arguing about each daisy, which we'll probably end up discussing some of those daisies, and that's good. You need practical stuff. I wanted to see if I could figure out where some of the fence posts were. If we could figure out what the fenced-in field looks like, then we can discuss the daisies. But if you're looking at a field and you don't know where it ends, you really can't have a discussion to begin with. So I thought, well, can I figure out what fence posts are fence posts that we can't let go of when we're talking to Muslims? That maybe they don't believe in, but they're fence posts for us. These are not the places where you begin in discussing Islam. These are the things you have to have in your heart and head in the background when you're talking. Okay? So you've sat through some stuff on methodology. I learned a whole lot. Okay? This is not the stuff to discuss. This is the stuff you need to know to have an intelligent conversation and know where the boundaries are on the big field side. And maybe the boundaries are 10 feet in from that fence or 15 feet in, but you at least have to know where the fence is to begin with. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yep.
You have to know what the external limits are to begin to fine-tune it. So I thought, wow, let me see if I can suggest a few of these. This list isn't exhaustive, but if I was going to define orthodoxy, if I was going to define the beliefs that everybody in this room should share, okay, and I was to start to define those, and I was not going to go ahead and recite the Apostles' Creed in Greek, okay, what things would I pick that are real important, that are just a few fence posts that we could put around? And what does Islam tend to say about them? I mean, do I have anything? You and I would agree about the inspiration of the scriptures, won't we?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be doing a little more on that tomorrow. Kind of a cumulative case, okay? But one of the things that strikes me is if you wanted to go ahead and argue about that, you'd have to sort of argue with Jesus, wouldn't you? Because he said he came not to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them, right? So, did Jesus' Bible include some of our books in his mind? It sure did, right?
Yep.
We established that?
Yep.
If you went to Paul, which isn't popular with certain groups of people, he would give you the verse that many of you memorized. All scripture is inspired by God and profitable for doctrine, reproof, correction, and instruction in righteousness. Right? Now, that's not where you start the discussion with a Muslim, but that needs to be in the back of your head, doesn't it? How could I argue for a message from a book that I don't believe is inspired? I need this for me. One of the great purposes of apologetics is not even for the unbeliever. Sometimes one of the great purposes for apologetics is for us to know reasonable reasons why we believe. For us to have a firm grasp that what we believe is reasonable, useful, profitable, mentally as well as spiritually. And so this is something you need to have in the back of your head. Now, you guys, man, some of you, I'm almost afraid to quote surahs. I mean, because I've got, Eddie, it's almost like, Eddie, you have it memorized. You know, if I had the tongue as memorized as Eddie does the Quran, I'd be in good shape. But you know that the Quran indicates that the scriptures, in some places indicates, yeah, the scriptures, but then seems to indicate they've been tainted. Now the important thing about this is this. When you're talking, there's what you know and believe, and then there's what the person believes who's talking with you, right? You can't agree with them to the extent that you give up this fence post, can you?
Exactly.
Okay, you can't let go of this fence post. It's not where you talk to them from, you're building the bridge, it's what you have to have a foot in while you're talking to them, so that you don't lose your footing. Long ago in college I did fencing, okay? If you're off balance, you can forget fencing. You cannot parry if you are in improper fencing stance, okay? You cannot block a blade if your feet are in balance. So when you're talking to the Muslim, you're building the bridge, but while you're building the bridge, you have your feet firmly planted in a stance that lets you keep your balance. So contextualization is allowed, but contextualization that gets me off balance and removes one of this fence post is going to leave me with no discussion. Because the minute that I remove this fence post, all of a sudden, this is going too far, and the field doesn't have a shape anymore. I've removed part of that fence post. I've also removed a good deal of the rationality for what I believe. Okay? I mean, you may not, and you probably shouldn't, bring up the Bible, but you know that you believe it. You want to get them to truths of it. If I remove the basis for what I believe, what message do I have to share? Not much. So it's this fencing thing where you're building a bridge. Fencing may not be the best example when you're talking to a Muslim, right? But you're building the bridge, but you still have to make sure that when you're reaching out to someone, you have solid footing. If you're going to pull somebody out of a well, if you're going to pull somebody out of a ledge, you better have your feet planted as you're reaching out to them. And this is one of those fence posts. So anything that's going to cause me to deny clearly that fence post is not going to be acceptable contextualization. Okay? That's an important one of those things. And if I just said to my Muslim friend, yeah, sure, I'm willing to give that up. Now, most of us are saying we would never give that up, right? Do you know denominations, liberal denominations, that have given this footing up? That are giving this footing up in order to have this discussion? And I'm not picking on, see, names are always out of this. You just have to know what's going on. You just have to know that there are some groups out there that are trying to reach out, but they aren't keeping their footing, and it can't be us. It's one of the things we can't do. Okay? And so as we're going through this, resurrection, is it important Jesus rose from the dead?
Yes.
Not as a place to start with the Muslims, but do we have to have a reason for believing that?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the big joke is, what good is a dead Messiah? Right? I love that he did that. Is Jesus alive? Is Muhammad alive?
No.
And he did that brilliantly. If you weren't up here, it was like, this is fun. This is really cool. But we know that it's not just a matter of him never having died. Because if you took away the resurrection and you just made it a matter of never having died, that would leave the gospel with a problem, wouldn't it? It sure would. Now again, there's a difference between your footing and you're reaching your hand out. But just know where your feet are. Okay? That's not something we could give up. Is that something that a Muslim's going to readily accept, though?
No.
So you're keeping a footing where their feet won't go while you're reaching out, aren't you? Are there groups that question whether that was an actual resurrection?
Yes.
Sure there are. Sure there are. But you can't move your feet. You have to reach your hand out, but you have to keep your feet in the right place, don't you? So contextualization's allowed, but we've got at least 2 fence posts that we can't go past, right? And I had the surah on the resurrection that says, no, it wasn't really Jesus that died. I have down Surah 4, 157, that it was really another person, which that would, I'm always fascinated when Muslims say that to me, because if that were true, boy, wouldn't the Pharisees have had an argument. If I was a Pharisee and I wanted to disprove this, I'd just say, yeah, I'm sorry, the color hair was just a little off. He's about 2 inches too short. I mean, I would have brought that stuff up pretty quick. I would have been paying attention to who went where. Not maybe the greatest argument to use with a Muslim, but it just fascinates me. Because I know how bad Jesus' opponents wanted to not say he had risen. I mean, if they could have found any excuse to say he hadn't risen, they would have probably been the first ones to say it. You're not going to move right to the deity of Christ, right? Because what we're preaching is the gospel. Is it still an important issue, though? I mean, can I just jettison it? Can I just throw it away in my footing? Can I give up that ground?
No.
Absolutely not. Now, what's interesting to me is how many times I hear Jesus didn't claim to be God. John 10, I and the Father are one. Some people say, oh, one in purpose. Then the Jews took up stones to stone him. Why? I mean, he goes on to say, because I'm, are you killing me because I'm a nice guy, because of the many works? And the Jews answered, it's not because of the good work, it's because of blasphemy. You being a man make yourself out to be God. Did they understand the claim? They understood the claim. We understand that they understood the claim. Why in the world would they have such a problem with this? They didn't want him to be God. That's kind of problematic. It's not ground we can give up. It's ground we don't start with. But the key with contextualization is you're meeting people where they're at and you're bringing truth to them in a way they can understand. So you don't start with where you're at, but you know where you're going. You know where the road ends, even though you started to take the trip. That's not a place that we can give up. We cannot start there. We don't begin our presentation there, but in the back of our heads, what are we keeping track of? We're keeping track of what we believe. Will it come up? Somewhere along the line, I think it will. I think it has to. And so we have to be ready in the back of our heads to know this is an issue I'm not starting with. This is an issue that's not part of my immediate presentation, but it's an issue that I probably should be somewhat prepared for. Because it probably will come up. Because you guys all well know that that's probably one of the biggest problems that Islam has with us, right? What's it called to create partners with Allah? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah, that's like a big no-no, right? But we can't win our Muslim friends by jettisoning that. We may not begin there, but in our back of our heads, we need to know that that's a fence post that defines the meadow of orthodoxy for us, right?
Yep.
So this isn't necessarily new thoughts. I'm giving you a picture and saying, okay, if I could put down some fence posts, let me put down some fence posts for you tonight. And then our speakers on our panel, they'll have the incredible wherewithal and honor to help you with maybe a little more within that meadow. But let's cast the meadow broad, and then we can shrink it down. I learned a long time ago in teaching that it was easier to set the rules of the class and then make the exceptions. But if you had a group of high schoolers in Christian school and you made the exceptions first, you never got back to the rules. So you create the meadow first, and then we can talk about the fine points. Hebrews is probably not big. I really like it. I don't know how useful it is. But for me, one of the big things to me is to say that Jesus is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his person. And you say, why is that a big deal? Because that's what dwelt between the cherubim. My dad had a problem with this once, and I said, Dad, let me see if I can understand this. Which is harder, for God to appear in a burning bush or for God to come as a man? Just so that I know which is harder. Okay? And that was like the end of that discussion. Okay? Those are the sorts of things I apologetic. Let me give you a hypothetical. Which is more difficult? Okay? Dad, which is harder, to create the universe or be born of a virgin? Just so that I know which is harder for God. Those are fun sorts of things, but this is ground that your feet's on, even though you aren't starting them. These aren't earth-shaking. We know Colossians 2, for in him all the fullness of the Godhead dwells. We know these things. But in contextualization, the important thing is to know what you can't give up before you know what you can give up. And so that's why I'm hammering this. And I think there's too many folks that are willing to give up the fence posts in order to make the meta larger. And that's my concern. I want to reach the Muslim, but I don't want to do it at the expense of the things that make my faith what it is. Because that would be wrong. Missionologists argue all the time over the use of Allah, not the use of Allah. That's something that can be discussed here, but at least I know who my Jesus is, if I'm going to know something. Okay? Surah 171. Actually, my version, which I think is the Pickthall in my computer, says do not say three. It doesn't say do not say Trinity. Some versions, English versions of the Quran, I think have moved to do not say Trinity. And so there's some discussion about that. This particular version says do not exceed the limits of your religion. Do not speak against Allah. And then it goes on to say do not say three. And so we know that this is a fence post that we and our Muslim friends are not going to agree on, just like the resurrection, okay? Just like those other fence posts, we can work with, we can contextualize biblically, but if you thought there was going to be perfect agreement, you're dead wrong. And you already know that, but I want to reiterate it because it's too easy to move your feet when you're trying to reach out. And so I just wanted to set the parameters of the discussion that others can be more brilliant with. I was so excited to hear that you could use things like the golden calf, like the blood sacrifices, because that's all stuff that I use in evangelism. I just have to not, and until today I didn't get it from the Quran. I had to get it the old-fashioned way from the scriptures, but now I know the places I can turn. I've done enough Isaiah 53 tables to know Isaiah 53:6 by heart. Okay. Why is that so important? It's just so vital. It makes all the difference in the world. There's so many people today that are enlightened that don't like the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals doesn't like blood atonement. PETA doesn't like blood atonement. But is it absolutely vital? It's vital to understanding what happened. We need to understand what Jesus did. We need to understand that all those pictures of all those sacrifices were designed specifically as pictures to teach a group of people exactly that they couldn't provide what was needed. It had to be provided for them, and that sin was really ugly business. And knee-deep in animal blood ought to just about do it for you. Okay? And so that's the reason for that. When I looked at the Quran, it was kind of funny because the sacrifice of Abraham's son is perfectly in the Quran, but then in another place, one person can't bear the sin of another. And so there's kind of a mixed thing there. But there's no mixed thing for us, right? We understand exactly what that particular fence post means. Now we get to what spent so much time, the gospel. In a merit-based religion, which I sort of grew up in, it wasn't a straight merit, it wasn't individualistic, it was corporate, it was still merit-based. And it was so good to see that. That's a place we really do need to go. Our message is anything but merit, isn't it? That changes everything. I mean, that absolutely changes everything. Any merit system is going to create a problem. And so we need to go back to, everybody knows John 3:16. It would have impressed me before I was saved, because I didn't know who John was, I had never met him. But it's vital to me now. We understand that. And watching the interplay, you guys who missed the role play, you missed such fun.
Yeah.
You know?
No thanks.
Yeah, one of the role players had the easier part, and the other one was like trying to keep up. But it was so key to ask that question. It was so important, and it's the heart of our gospel message, is that God provided what we never could. He did what we never could, and we know that. Eddie demonstrated pretty clearly that Islam is not really a grace-based thing, is it? Absolutely not. By the way, where you have a merit system, you never have assurance. I don't know about the Muslim, but I used to wake up after the Day of Atonement to see if I was still alive. And then I went downstairs. The Muslim has their equivalent. You can't know in a merit-based system because you can never know what amount of merit you've completed, what amount of merit would be acceptable, and no amount of merit other than perfection is acceptable, so you're already behind the eight ball. Okay. I have not been as profound as I'd like. That's what the speakers on the panel are for. But what I wanted to do was, when we're thinking about this whole thing, instead of trying to find a particular issue, like can we use Allah, what we really need to do is see how the particular issue fits in with the fence posts. Am I denying any of the fence posts as I go through? And know what the field, the meadow looks like, and then start discussing the things in the meadow. And I think if we can principleize those things from the meadow, we can look at, okay, is this a denial of Scripture? How does the character of God in the Scriptures and the character of what we see here match? Are the divine attributes of both deities the same? I think we're asking better questions than let's create a hard and fast rule and sit there and hate each other because we have a different methodology as far as this particular issue. If we look at those other fence posts and we say, okay, are we denying any of those fence posts by what we're doing? That's a better approach than arguing methodology, particularly, or a particular issue. I'm not removing the particular issues. I'm saying there's room for some flexibility as long as we stay in the meadow. But when we start to transgress the meadow, then that should become out of bounds. And that's where things should not be allowed. And so maybe I want to begin with the discussion of contextualization just by painting you a mental picture of how to deal with the issue. And I think the methodology is the one of paying attention to the fence posts. And I didn't suggest all the fence posts. There are other ones there. I suggested some of them. The deity of Messiah relates to the Trinity. Okay.